New Zealand has seen house prices crash by some of the largest amounts in the developed world. And now on top of that, their economy has fallen into recession. So is this recession going to put further downward pressure on New Zealand house prices and erase all the speculative gains made since COVID? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. If you're bloody tough, just like my Kiwi friends, power, why don't you give this video a like? And if you're looking for independent analysis and commentary on the housing market and broader economy, consider subscribing to my channel. It might just be the best decision of your entire life. Remember, I said might. Now let's check out New Zealand housing. Alright, so New Zealand's gross domestic product, or GDP, has fallen now for 2 consecutive quarters, which is the technical definition of a recession. In the last quarter of 2022, GDP fell by 0.7%, and in the first quarter of 2023, it fell by 0.1%. Now you might think a GDP fall of 0.1% is nothing, and you'd be right, but when we measure real GDP in per capita terms, or per person, the situation is actually a lot worse. That shows us a 1.1% fall in the December quarter and a 0.7% fall in the March 2023 quarter. Now that paints a much worse picture for the New Zealand economy. So why are the per capita GDP figures worse? Well, it's because of this: surging population growth due to record immigration levels. So what happens when you increase a population quickly is that it helps the overall economic figures, such as GDP, because you've got more people contributing to the economy. But the real reality of record population growth is that each individual can actually be worse off. And that's something that both New Zealand and Australian governments seem to be obsessed with: growing the economy by increasing the population. Now, I've always said that there's nothing wrong with immigration, and it's very important for most countries. But it doesn't take an Einstein to see that we're in the middle of a housing crisis. COVID policies artificially inflated house prices to ridiculous levels, and now we're paying the price for that with record inflation, which means the cost of living has just exploded, and now ultra high interest rates to try and tame those record inflation levels. So now New Zealand is a country divided, where those who own multiple properties and those who have little or no mortgages are still riding high due to the housing boom and the 2 years of ultra low interest rates. Compare that with renters and recent home buyers with large mortgages who are absolutely being smashed. New Zealand has created a 2-tier wealth system between the property haves and the property have-nots. And when many hard-working New Zealanders can't afford their own home, something's gone bloody wrong. Now, it's not surprising that New Zealand's economy has fallen into a recession, because the Reserve Bank of New Zealand went ultra hard with interest rate rises. And when I say hard, I'm thinking about the hardest maths in school, where you had to do all those weird formulas that you never use for the rest of your life. I'm talking about rugby sevens, where you're basically running the entire match and your heart feels like it's going to explode out of your chest. I'm talking about beating a Kiwi in an arm wrestle type hard. So the RBNZ has basically raised interest rates faster than any other developed country, and they're now sitting at a cash rate of 5.5%. Now look at Australia here at 4.1%, and everyone's crying and freaking out. Imagine having a huge mortgage in New Zealand. If you're on a fixed rate, you might be okay for a little while, but for those on variable or those having to come off a fixed rate, your mortgage is going to be around 7.5 to 8%. What an absolute shock to the financial system, and a massive impact to businesses and mortgage holders. Now let's dive into New Zealand house prices. Starting from the peak, this dotted line shows the national average of New Zealand house prices. So across the entire nation, they've fallen 17.6% from the peak. But what about the areas that fell the most? In pink here we've got Auckland, and this dark line indicates Wellington. And we can see Auckland's fallen 22.8% and Wellington a massive 25.6%. So both Auckland and Wellington have fallen crash type levels. But we have to remember, they went up ridiculous levels during the COVID boom. Looking at the longer term chart, we can see how house prices really started to accelerate up until about 2016, grew more slowly for a few years, and then with COVID policies went on an absolute absolute scream. And check out Auckland's house prices. But this reversal from the peak has been ultra sharp. It's still above COVID levels, but a massive amount of these speculative gains have been totally erased. Unlike Australia, where house prices have only fallen around 8% from the peak. But the RBA in Australia keeps raising rates, so that overall housing strength could soon change. So when I think of New Zealand's property market, I think extremely volatile. Soaring house prices, followed by a sharp reversal, surging cost of living due to inflation, followed by unprecedented interest rate hikes. So what does all this mean? Well, New Zealand, just like Australia, is extremely over-leveraged into property, prompting some analysts to declare that New Zealand was a canary in the coal mine for a property crash. Now, what actually does a canary in a coal mine mean? Let me know. Now, because New Zealand's house price crash from the peak has been so sharp, a lot of buyers that bought during that boom will now be in a negative equity position. And what that means is that they owe more to the bank than what the house could be sold for right now. And that's the absolute worst position to be as a property owner, especially if you can no longer afford the mortgage and you're forced to sell. So just say you bought in Auckland during the boom, you bought a house for 1.2 million, you had a $200,000 deposit, and you borrowed 1 million from the bank. Now that might seem a lot to loan, but those scenarios were actually happening during COVID. So across Auckland, house prices have fallen over 20%, so your $1.2 million house might now be only worth $970,000. So you sell the house for $970, take off costs, and you might be left with $950, but you still owe the $1 million to the bank. So at the moment, there may not be too many people in a negative equity position, but if house prices continue to fall, negative equity will start catching more people on the way down, and that could be disastrous. Now, most homeowners with large mortgages will do anything in their power to keep their house and not be forced to sell it. So that means they'll dramatically cut back on their spending. And this is where the real issues for the economy will start. You see, when people really start cutting back on spending, it means businesses' income and profit dramatically starts reducing, and that leads to layoffs. So at the moment, we've still got this afterglow from all the COVID policies because employment's so strong and unemployment's so low. But that's a lagging indicator because we're already seeing signs that many businesses are starting to struggle. So it's inevitable that unemployment levels will start to rise from here, and that's when the real pain for the property market might commence. And that could mean further downward pressure on property prices. You see, house prices in New Zealand have already fallen sharply, even though unemployment is at ultra low levels. If unemployment levels start rising back to 5%, it will mean that many people just won't be able to pay their mortgages and will be forced to sell their properties. And forced selling is when housing crashes really start to accelerate. And that was witnessed in many countries during the GFC. Another factor that could have an impact on the New Zealand housing market is the entire global economy, with the Deutsche Bank recently stating that a recession in the US has a probability of 100%, or in other words, it's inevitable. And if we start seeing a decline in the entire global economy, that will affect businesses in countries like New Zealand and Australia, which will most likely lead to increased unemployment. So the big question, where to now for New Zealand house prices? Prior to COVID, the median house price was around 680,000, went all the way up to 925,000, and is now sitting at 780,000. So if the median house price fell another 100,000, we'd be back to pre-COVID levels. And wouldn't that be one for the history books? Now, just like Australia, New Zealand house prices have recently shown signs that they might have bottomed and might be starting to improve from here. So what's gonna happen? Well, on the one hand, record immigration levels could help keep demand strong and could help to prop up house prices. But on the other hand, unemployment levels will most likely start rising over the months ahead, and this could start another period of declining house prices. Personally, I'm leaning to further declines for New Zealand house prices, which could take them all the way back to pre-COVID levels. But as you know, anything can happen in the markets. But one thing's for sure, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. I'm Biko Konstantinos.